Welcome back to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast. My name is Dylan Carmody, and I'm a physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach from the U.S. On today's show, we have Matt Cuthbert, and we'll be discussing his recent paper, Microdosing, a conceptual framework for use as programming strategy for resistance training in sport.
Today's episode of the Informed Performance podcast has been sponsored by VALD Performance, makers of the Nordbord. The Nordbord has become the gold standard for assessing field-based hamstring strength. By combining advanced sensors, real-time data visualizations, and cloud analytics, the Nordbord helps practitioners to accurately measure, monitor, and train individuals' hamstring strength or imbalances. To learn more about the Nordbord, visit our sponsor, VALDperformance.com. Informed Performance is proudly partners with HumanTrak Norm by CSMI. If you or your organisation has a BioDecks or Cybex, then is your old software or computer slowing you down? If yes, then check out the HumanTrak software or computer upgrade for BioDecks systems 2, 3 and 4, and also the HumanTrak Norm. Since 1982, over 3,000 Cybex and BioDecks owners have rejuvenated the isokinetic machine they already own with the HumanTrak system by CSMI. To learn more about the HumanTrak upgrade, then head to humantracknorm.com and select products and upgrades. Informed Performance is proud to partner with Sportscientia, an emerging precision technology that harnesses the power of AI and machine learning to seamlessly capture gait analysis in real-world conditions and provide 3D depictions of the foot during both swing and stance phases of the gait cycle. This enables practitioners to further break down analysis of athletes running and moving in multi-directional movements, their forces, their max speeds, distances, steps, and more. To get more information, head to their website, sportscientia.com.
Matt, thanks for being on the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Matt, I've been really looking forward to this paper and, just this conversation about it, just because I think this is such an interesting topic that I think is really new and is helpful for, people to conceptualize how we can then allocate stressors, allocate loads to individuals throughout, whether it's team sport, individual sport, the applications can be almost endless. But before we dive too far into microdosing and all of those sorts of things, can you just share with the listeners a little bit more about yourself, some of the roles and responsibilities you hold, and maybe how you got there?
Yeah, so I'm Matt Cuthbert. I'm a physical performance coach is my title for the Football Association in England. So I work with our national teams, particularly on the women's side. So the age group I work with currently is the women's under 17s, and then we provide support to under 15s up to under 23s, and then help support some of the off-pitch work and the sort of strategic development side of things that then support the senior. So it's like the full pathway that we work with. So it's mostly strength and conditioning support, with then a bit of like nutrition thrown in. Like we've only got one nutritionist that covers the whole pathway, so we'll have a bit of that, and then work across our multidisciplinary team on camps when we deliver to players, and like I said, some of the strategic development off camps. So yeah, that's where I'm at currently. Prior to that, or within that, I suppose I completed my PhD that was funded by the FA. So that's how I got the role initially. And then I've been employed full time following that. So my PhD looked into microdosing, and microdosing as a concept was an interest to the FA because of like heavy fixture congestion within the international tournaments. So it was a problem that they thought microdosing could be a solution to. So they wanted that investigating further, which is where I was fortunate enough to get the role. Prior to that, I've completed my master's in strength and conditioning, working for a boys football academy here in the UK. And then prior to that, I was doing my undergrad where I did various different S&C roles supporting university teams. So it's been sort of straight through undergrad, master's, PhD. We're picking up as much experience along the way as I could.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. And especially having all of that experience at, the University of Salford, especially just like such a such an amazing university, as well as just you look at the list of authors on this paper, and you got a powerhouse here for sure. What aspects, I guess, about your master's and your PhD do you feel like were the most influential in terms of shaping your thought process as it comes to athlete health and performance?
So I guess like during my master's, it was very much like research focused. So we had like practical elements to that. It was a follow on from what we went through at the undergrad at Salford as well. So it's really good for upskilling on actually sort of the Olympic weightlifter stuff, which, because Paul Comfort is one of the lead lecturers or leads the master's program, he's very much obviously got the research background within that. There's the practical, the practical aspects alongside that run with the theory and the research profile that he's got. But then there's loads of stuff around like injury prevention, performance measurement, to do with the testing that feeds into like physical profiling of players, which then rolls into like the research side. So it's I guess shape my practice because like the rigor that they go through in terms of like these testing protocols, you want it to be both informative for practice and relevant for research. So it's that sort of influenced my approach considerably. And then rolling into PhD, it's then how can the research really like benefit practice? I think is been a big thing for me in that. Like we had a research question. We wanted it to have real world application. It's like the data to inform rather than to and drive sort of the change rather than actually making decisions for us. So I guess that's how it's evolved for me.
Yeah, I mean, and that's so awesome, especially just having the applicability of the information that like you're currently studying within actual practice. I feel like, especially from the world that I really come from and like the physio side of things, there's always this idea behind like, oh, well, like application or practice is 15 years ahead of the research, or the research is 10 years ahead of practice. But the reality is, like there's the same goal in mind. And each time that you create new evidence and then implement it into practice, it's an iterative and like recursive loop almost of like one feeds into the next, which feeds into the next, and I think that having those types of experiences, I think for sure must have helped you out like tremendously in terms of also having gone through like your entirety of schooling at the same program with consistent influences and consistent feedback from the same individuals the whole time. I think that must have been great. Without getting too far down one track or anything, I kind of want to just dive into, definitions and understanding what microdosing is. I think like back in 2021, you guys had put out an awesome systematic review that seemed maybe from like an outsider's perspective to be like the spark for this new microdosing paper. But it was really more on like this idea of training frequency and all these sorts of things within a microcycle. Providing a little bit more context, I guess, for what microdosing is, can you maybe just give us a 10,000 foot view about microdosing and its potential applicability to team sport?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as you sort of alluded to previously, is that it isn't necessarily just team sports, but I think there's definitely applications across individual athletes, across sort of tactical groups, and even like just high performance athletes in the way that we've got, or I'm aware of someone doing a lot of like microdosing research in ballet dancers as well. And I think that space is probably like this, space for microdosing to be applicable within that performance art space as well. But so microdosing for us, which we defined in the paper that you mentioned, is just the division of total volume within a microcycle across short duration short duration repeated bouts. So as you said, it was more of like a training frequency review than it was specifically microdosing, which was a precursor to the review we're discussing today. But at its most basic form, I think microdosing is just it's that division of volume and the increase of frequency, because we're starting to identify the fact that provided volumes are equated or volume loads are equated, then the frequency within your microcycle doesn't matter too much. So you sort of need to go in with a plan of, okay, these are the volumes that we're looking at getting, and that being progressive throughout your microcycles. But once you get to that point, actually, then you can start being a bit more manipulative and a bit more deliberate in the way that you divide those up, depending on the goals that you're going after. So we've obviously divided it into various either benefits or ways that microdosing can influence those programming decisions into competition schedule, acute chronic programming, motor learning, and individualization. And then we've got a few different strands within those, but they're sort of the 4 different buckets that we think that microdosing can have the biggest impact in, and maybe summarize all of the other areas that we think microdosing has an influence in or could potentially be influenced by in some respects as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think the organization that you guys had laid out in the review paper that we'll be chatting about, I think was phenomenal, just in terms of like how it was very easily, the information was very easily transferred, as well as there's just like, you guys set yourself up like continually within each section in terms of understanding, giving adequate background to certain variables and certain strategies as well. And so I just think overall the paper as a whole, for those listening, is honestly like a must read for any kind of S&C coach, even PT or sports scientist that's working within this field. But something I really wanted to like kind of tease out a little bit was you guys had an awesome quote in the paper itself that I think I'm just going to read. And it says, without providing a full picture of the potential applications, benefits, and pitfalls of the concept, practitioners are likely to struggle to navigate between effective training practices and, quote, flavor of the month programming trends. And that is a little bit of a nod to Derek Hansen, obviously, with some of his early work kind of bringing out the idea of microdosing. But can you just maybe give us your take on what the difference is between microdosing and some other flavor of the month programming trend?
Yeah, so I think obviously we've gone into detail around like the depth and breadth, to be fair, of ways that microdosing could influence your programming, and be influenced by some of the periodization stuff as well. I think that comment around flavor of the month trend was that if you start labeling something that, then it maybe takes away the value that it could bring. Whereas, like for some individuals, it might be a flavor of the month trend because everyone's talking about it. They try it and only apply it in one sense without maybe any real clear objective or direction as to why they're applying it. And then they might then decide, oh, well, it doesn't work. It's not appropriate for our environment. So it might actually then be that flavor of the month trend. But I think if you're really clear on the reason why, so like I'm using microdosing to influence this because of these constraints or the environment that we're in, then at that point, it will be an effective way. And I think there's, an effective method of programming. I think you've then got sort of, a much clearer view of how you're applying it and why you're applying it, so that there's so many different ways in which you could do that. To have a positive influence on your athletes, so that it doesn't then just become that flavour of the month trend. So, I think there's so many different facets to it that it means that we can summarize it, or it's more of like an umbrella term that will encompass a lot of different things and different influence from different research areas, that it's probably something that's going to stick around for a long while. Well, I hope so anyway.
Yeah, no, Matt, 100%. And it seems like a lot of it almost almost alluding to this idea of like user error, almost, like this idea behind like you need to, within any aspect of strength and conditioning, sports science, physio, like any of these areas, you have to have an intent for the things that you're doing, right? And a lot of times it may just seem like, oh, well, like I tried this and this didn't work for me, therefore it's BS. I don't want to use it for whatever reason. It's like, well, why did you implement it in the first place? Was there a problem that this intervention was trying to solve? Or was this something that you saw and said, I want to try that out, so I'm just going to input it into the system that may already be functioning totally fine within how you operate? And so I think that it is interesting, and I really appreciate the way that you guys put that in there, is because it's like you need to make the informed decision to implement this into your practice, based on the idea of like you need to understand where it works, where it doesn't work, what it is and what it isn't, before you even think about implementing it into a different area of your practice. And I think that just like the background that you guys gave was phenomenal.
I think, and who it will work for as well. Like one thing that we particularly going after at England is sort of this collective individualization. Like you might have a big group that you work with. It might only be appropriate for like 2 or 3 of them. But at that point, then it still has the potential to benefit them like tenfold compared to other methods. So yeah, I guess I'd add in like who it's appropriate for as well.
When you guys were, constructing this paper and kind of setting it up, you talked about this idea of training residuals, right? And I think as an overarching concept, most people can probably get behind the idea of what a training residual really is. But I think the kind of second layer that you guys went into is really interesting for me in terms of understanding like the 3 different types of like a short-term, medium-term, long-term training residual, and then what we're specifically trying to focus in on when we're implementing some type of microdosing type approach. Can you maybe give us a background in terms of what those types of training residuals are and what our focus is when you're implementing some type of microdosing?
Yeah, so I guess with the long-term residuals, it's sort of a lot of the like motor control and some of the neural changes that you'll make. And a lot of that has the potential to have happened earlier on in your athletic career, sort of part of that long-term athletic development, or part of just your not general specific, that's an oxymoron, but your sort of like general preparation work that you do that creates long-term change. That actually, once you stop doing it, then it comes back quite quickly. It's like you might end up stopping playing sport as a kid, specialize in something else. But actually, if you go back to some of that and the skills that you learn and the motor patterns, generally, you'll be able to, it's like riding a bike, as the analogy, I guess, is you'll be able to pick it up and get crack on straight away with it. So that's those sort of longer term residuals that don't necessarily need constant work to either improve upon or to be able to revert back to. Then I guess the medium term sort of includes some of the like cardio system, or like stroke volume and some of those things that actually will take a month or 2 if you stop doing it, or stop doing maybe specific work on that it'll take a bit of time to completely start detraining. And then the shorter term is sort of your strength and your power and some of your sort of anaerobic work that will very quickly drop off if you're not repeatedly applying a specific stimulus to that. So I think like when you think about sport specific training and like the technical work that they'll like team sport athletes will end up doing day in, day out, a lot of that is some of the long-term residual stuff. So like that motor skill learning and stuff that they've just got offhand. Like you see some retired football or soccer players, that like regardless of how long it's been since they've trained, like you see your Beckhams or your Rooneys and they can still like, I think Rooney was involved in your like MLS like all-star stuff and absolutely like smashed it into the top corner like it was nothing. Like he'll still be doing stuff most days because he's coaching, but like just don't lose those type of skills. Whereas then the strength and the power work and sort of the explosive side of how you apply force can very quickly drop off. And that's sort of the things we think that microdosing has an influence on, especially during sports that have a long season where I guess the focus is on recovery and performance week in, week out. So at that point, if you're starting to neglect some of those components, then you've got a potential increase in injury risk or propensity for injury, and then also a decrease in performance, which is obviously not what the goal is when you're going throughout a season, particularly as you get to the end of the season and you've got your playoffs, you've got the more important games, or you're coming up against tougher opponents. So, that's sort of where those residuals were at. And we probably see most importance or most application of the microdosing within that shorter term. But actually, for some of the medium-term stuff, like your cardio work, or if you are going through a season that doesn't necessarily end up being a focus, you might still be able to use microdosing to top that up, because I guess there's some research for some like various sports where actually you might want to accumulate like 3 or 4 hours, like picking up out my head, but like 3 or 4 hours worth of like the zone 2, like the lower steady state exercise. Will actually trying to convince a player to do that all in one go, compared to, or like divided that into like 2 sessions, compared to actually then just as part of their general warm-ups and getting ready for the day, you might microdose and drip feed that in. So they're almost putting money in the bank for when it becomes like tougher during the season. So I think there's probably some level of application for sort of the medium-term stuff. But yeah, I think we see most of it within that shorter-term space.
Yeah. And especially this application. I think a lot of times when we talk about within season, now there's obviously nuance depending on the sport itself or the individual, or what the qualities are. But I feel like so much of in season kind of athlete management is just like this idea of like holding on to the residuals or the training qualities that this individual has right now. And I think that microdosing lends itself very well in terms of just being able to apply that in terms of a way in which that individual can just maintain those qualities and things like that. And maybe we'll get into the idea of minimal effective dosing later, just because I think those seem to be almost misconstrued as synonyms. But we'll kind of pencil that for a later discussion.
Just a quick break in the conversation with Matt. At Informed Performance, you may have noticed that we're launching more webinars and courses online from some of the expert guests that we're lucky to record episodes with. If you head to informedperformance.com and click on education, you can see our growing webinar and course offering. One upcoming example is Claire Robertson, who we just had on the show, who's releasing a course with us called Managing Patellofemoral Pain for Athletes. We'll be releasing regular offers and new courses, so keep an eye on our education page so you don't miss out.
I really want to kind of pivot a little bit and just talk a little bit more in terms of the idea of periodization models. I feel like, they're fun to discuss conceptually, but I feel like rarely do they really provide like tangible influences on outcomes in terms of just like these kinds of conversations that we can always say, well, I like to do phase potentiation or block periodization, or I like to do this type of model or whatever. Whereas in reality, we're just trying to make sure that we can emphasize the qualities that we're trying to throughout the entirety of a season or a microcycle or anything like that, which brings up the idea of an emphasis model and the idea of having primary, secondary, and tertiary goals within that plan. Can you maybe walk us through the ways in which you can use microdosing to influence some type of a emphasis style model in terms of periodization?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I kind of alluded to it like previously in the way that your microdosing, is then like the division across your microcycle. So when you think about periodization and just your planning of training, you've obviously got like your top level macro stuff leading into your meso, and like the microdosing essentially is just the programming of your microcycle, and you can manipulate it however you want. So actually, if you are going for this emphasis periodization model where you might spend a couple of weeks really going after your strength, and then your power being more of a secondary, or your endurance then being that tertiary, then actually at that point you may want to really focus any like big blocks of time on that strength work, and then your power work or your endurance work might be the stuff that is microdosed, so that it has less impact on the stuff you're really trying to focus on, you may end up being sort of benefiting from the fact that you'll if you do your strength work to begin with and then all your power work in one go, then actually you're going to be fatigued for that power work, and therefore velocities, although intended velocity might be maximal, which we obviously from the research know that there's benefits to that, then the actual velocity may end up being a lot slower because of that fatigue. So separating the two and microdosing your power across that week, then, or that microcycle, I was talking in terms of weeks, but actually, like, we probably get really het up around like the microcycle being a 7-day period, because we tend to go game to game within a season, which, I mean, depending on how your season's structured, will maybe be around a week. But your microcycle could be 10 days. Some of the stuff we talked about in the review, Isherin has talked about a mini block, which is 2 weeks of condensed and focused blocks of work. Again, that 2 weeks could, in theory, be a microcycle rather than anything else. So, yeah, I think there's flexibility within what your microcycle is. For us, when we go to tournaments, like potentially with the youth age groups, we only ever have a day. Well, we'll have 2 days in between fixtures, so it's really quick turnarounds for us. There are sports like, I know, ice hockey, basketball, where you've got like next day you've got a game. I know ice hockey's that way anyway. So yeah, you can have back-to-back games. Same with I guess baseball as well, where your microcycle actually might include 2 or 3 games, and that's where but it still ends up being quite short. So yeah, I think there's flexibility within that. And so your emphasis can vary around that, I think. So I've talked about sort of the strength coming in 2 blocks and being that focus. If your power is focused, you may still want to microdose that, because again, you benefit from the reduced fatigue. But then that ends up being the bulk of your work, and you then may either microdose your strength alongside it, or you still have strength, but it might only be in one solid block rather than across 2, depending on what volumes you're going for. So I think it's probably worth mentioning how relative it all is, because I think depending on the training status of your athletes and how strong they are and things, and what their training history is, actually for someone with a large training age who has to then warm up to big loads, then 2 a day for them, where they've still got really high volumes, might be microdosing as an approach, because you're still dividing that volume. You might do repeated 2 a days throughout a week, depending on what sport you're in. Whereas like some of the soccer players I end up working with, their training history from a resistance point of view isn't very high. They're still very young athletes, and actually the division for us of their total training volume is 50 minutes worth across multiple times across across a microcycle. So yeah, there's nuances around how you then periodize them and what's more appropriate for others. But yeah, I guess that's a couple of examples of how you might emphasize certain characteristics compared to others.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one aspect of this microdosing concept, I guess, that I found super interesting is this, you guys gave the examples from a short term to long term, and the idea of cluster sets, right? In terms of the main reason why a lot of us use cluster sets is in terms of being able to, either repeat exposures to the same higher loads, have greater velocities within those exposures, or have greater loads within those exposures. Generally, some type of maximizing intent with increasing volume. And I think that that's really important, especially within a microdosing kind of phase, just because you are essentially not only equalizing the same number of reps that you would get within a certain microcycle, but you're also improving the actual quality of those reps, or the intent behind those reps, because each time somebody comes into a session, they may be a little bit more fresh, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I guess one of the groups of things we've talked about is the acute chronic programming, and we wanted to try, and I think you summarised it really well there, try and highlight the fact that across that acute and chronic continuum, there's a number of different approaches that will look the same, whether they're short term or long term, but they're just then labelled differently, and maybe the mechanisms for like the adaptation that occurs as a result, or the objective that you're trying to reach with those, then changes with the time period that changes. So I almost liken microdosing as a chronic form of cluster setting, which again, like I said, just summarised really well. Whereas we then talked about like your contrast sets, then expands out and becomes like your undulating type of training. So we've tried to highlight the fact that no matter how you look at it, whether it's acute or chronic, the picture looks similar. It's then just the mechanisms or the underpinning theory or the label that then might change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's some gold right there, Matt. I love it. So you guys can kind of like used microdosing as a method for honestly a bunch of different performance enhancing concepts, right? I feel like within the audience of our listeners, I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with the idea of, post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement, excuse me. But I really thought that the idea and like the concepts that you guys used from the resistance priming discussion was super intriguing. Could you maybe just talk a little bit more about what resistance priming is, and then how you can implement some of the concepts you talked about in the paper within kind of some type of microdosing implementation?
Yeah, so I guess this almost links back to that acute chronic spectrum, where you've got your post-activation potentiation, which happens like within seconds of whatever stimulus is given. There's a paper that we referenced within the review that Blazevic's group has done, where they really highlight the difference between PAP, so post-activation potentiation, and then PAPE, post-activation performance enhancement. So that's a really good paper to sort of separate the two out. So I'd say PAPE is a more chronic version of PAP, where it will happen over a few minutes. I'll talk about like the application of that in a second. And then priming is almost a chronic version it's like the next step along. So that can happen over, depending on the athletes that you work with, but like 6 to 12 hours, roughly. But depending on where like the athlete's strength levels are, will then depend on like the time frame. But there's still a lot of research to be done in that space to really be a bit more accurate with that, and who it benefits, who it doesn't. Like it tends to be, I say it tends to be. So within the research sort of says that stronger individuals get the benefit from that rather than weaker individuals. How that's then summarised, because you've got to delineate them somehow. It's done off like percentage of 1RM. So actually, depending on the exercise, there might be some exercises that are more appropriate for those of their like sort of weaker, say that with air quotes, individual. But yeah, I see it as the like chronic version of post-activation performance enhancement, where you apply a stimulus, you may get a small amount of fatigue from that, a bit like your chronic your classic fitness fatigue model. You apply the stress, you get some fatigue, and then you compensate or super compensate from that, where you get an elevation in performance. So yeah, the time frame is sort of that 6 to 12 to maybe 18 hours post. And I guess the difference between the time frames is then just the load or the volume load that is then applied. So it always needs to be a high load. It's just then the volume. So you might do one set of whatever exercise to get a PAPE effect, whereas you might do 3 or 4 sets 6 hours prior or 12 hours prior to get the priming effect. Even with them, I think we view it as like a lot of the research in priming has been done in reference to match day, to try and improve performance. But for us, I guess it depends on the sport to some level, but I think the research highlights that you only get an improvement or a enhancement in performance for like 2 or 3 reps of a like maximal sprint or like counter movement jump or something. So actually, we view it more as a potential tool to enhance training again. The way that we talked about with power, where actually you're maybe going into it with less fatigue, the velocity that you then move at, or the power you're producing within those movements is greater than it would have been if you like put it all in one hit. This is maybe another way in which you consistently increase the intensity that training is performed at, so that you're then getting a greater chronic increase in adaptation. So that's probably where we see it more, because I think there's too many variables within a match performance for it to actually have enough of an effect. And I say that maybe it might be applicable to some sports, like individual sports, 100%. I think like you may get it from performance, but for match and team sports, I think it starts to get a bit like, yeah, you might get it for the first couple of reps of like an American football game. But beyond that, like those last they last for a few hours, but I mean, an actual game time is 60 minutes, and you're not going to get continuous benefits from that in your final quarter compared to the first quarter. So yeah, I think it's definitely one of those where we want to try and increase the intensity of training consistently so that the chronic adaptation then occurs.
Yeah, and I think that that's such an interesting point too, and also understanding that some of these sorts of priming drills, whether our target is post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement, a lot of these things like you can derive those benefits from a multitude of different interventions, right? It's not just an isometric mid-thigh pull, or it's not just a counter movement jump that can implement or improve that kind of performance. It can be sprints, it can be jumps, it can be bounding. There's evidence to support a multitude of different ways in which you can get to those enhancements. And so I think it's quite interesting to dive more into like understanding this idea behind, if our goal is to improve something, and that thing is a high intensity output like a sprint, well, why don't we just do a couple more sprint exposures, earlier on, so that we can enhance that performance later on. Not only are we, priming the nervous system like these mechanisms are implying, but we're also getting more reps doing the thing we're trying to get better at in the first place. I just think it's a very interesting concept to apply to a whole different host of applications.
Yeah, definitely. I think also, like, if you're training on the pitch every day, and I don't know with other sports how much like training load and like number of sprints and like the distances of that. Like we do it quite heavily with our players, where they'll have GPS units on. Like we'll monitor loads as they go through each microcycle. Their clubs do it. We get the information from their clubs. We pass it on so that they're not getting like huge spikes. But if you're planning on hitting a certain amount of sprint distance on a day, then actually if you can enhance the speed or the intensity of each of those reps, you're going to get greater adaptation long term. So yeah, I think it's that potential to influence, like the way we perhaps do it from a post-activation performance enhancement perspective is that that's a lot of fees. We will then our training sort of preparation going into it will be like we have individual prep as a sort of time for the players to get themselves ready, get themselves loose, like traditional like pre-activation, as people like to call it. Then we have team preparation where we'll do the high load off pitch work, which will then hopefully, depending on the group that you're with and the strength levels and stuff, will then have that pay effect for when we go out on the pitch and they perform those couple of sprints. So it also then, works into the day for us quite well in how that's applied.
Yeah, 100%. This kind of lends itself into like the idea of like this post-activation performance enhancement or any other kind of resistance priming that we've been talking about. But you guys also touched on this idea about the repeated bout effect within whether it's microdosing or just training as a whole. And the way I tend to explain this to other people is like you can have like this like bro science way of saying it. Well, it's like, well, I did 5x5 sets of squats or whatever on Monday, and then I was sore Tuesday and Wednesday. But then I did the same load and intensity the next week, and then I was only sore on Tuesday. But you also brought up like some evidence that I thought was super interesting, in that the repeated bout effect may not solely just be task specific, of like you squat heavy one time and then the second time you squat heavy, then it's the same task. So you have less like soreness, but you guys kind of brought in some ideas of interventions or implementations within sprinting or other activities. I don't want to steal your thunder too much, but can you maybe go into some of those implementations in terms of the use of the repeated bout effect?
Yeah, definitely. I think like we get quite, or maybe this is a generalization, but I feel like we sometimes get quite caught up on like exercises being specific, and like rather than actually like what the muscle or what the energy systems being used are actually doing. So I think like the repeated bout effect is most evident. It happens with like eccentric, concentric movements, but actually it's probably most evident as a result of the eccentric portion of that. Or it's certainly been shown and is exacerbated by eccentrics because of sort of the after effects and damages and the stimulation it can have. So yeah, I think like the idea behind that eccentric action is like it's lengthening of the muscles. It's maybe a bit more mechanical than neural, but that's probably going beyond my my area of all my knowledge area. So, but with that, I think that that's the specific. And we talk about it to coaches all the time, in the fact that okay, yes, this might not look like soccer, but within soccer, these things happen on a muscular level. So the same with sprinting. Like actually, the best way to protect from sprinting is sprinting, because it's the action is specific, but there's elements of that and muscle actions that are included that you can really exacerbate and really hone in on through other means. And actually, yeah, using that repeated bout effect may then have a protective effect for other exercises that may utilize the muscles in the same way. Like your muscles don't know whether you're pushing, like if you're in a squat, whether like you've got a barbell on your back or you're pushing against an opponent. Like it just knows that it's exerting force across a whatever plane that it's exerting it. So yeah, I think understanding the specificity of the adaptation that you're going for then crosses with actually then different actions as well. It's probably where we see that.
Yeah. And it's like this idea of, you are, you're applying this more like general type stimulus, right? But the responses are always, or the adaptations are always going to be specific. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a physio or PT in the States who works a lot with high level athletes. His name's Eric Mera. And he just came out with a blog post talking about how like the SAID principle always applies, right? Everything that you're doing is always going to be specific to like the thing that you are doing, right? And it's just very interesting though, of like, so often people are quick to jump to something that looks like the sport, but maybe doesn't load the individual like the sport. And it's like, what do you want to get out of this? Do you want it to like have the same kinematics, or do you want it to have the same kinetics? Because they're going to oftentimes largely be different unless you're just doing the thing or playing that sport,
Yeah, definitely. And I think when it comes to some of the actions that are sport specific, then it's when you go outside of them and that's where like injury is probably more prevalent, when you challenge outside, like when the load is suddenly a lot more than you perhaps ever experienced within the sport, or it's happened in a different position. So that's where then almost that experience or that training, when you're overloading it in different ways, maybe has benefits to it as well.
I think from an understanding in terms of like going back a little bit more specifics to microdosing, I could see, let's say you print out your like weekly training sheet, and for somebody who you're using some type of microdosing approach with, someone could look at that paper and just be like, oh my goodness, like they're training 4 times a week with practices, skill sessions, and 2 games within that week. How is this training frequency not making them burnt out, or how are they not so sore and going into each session? Can you maybe unravel some of like the ways in which you'd explain that to either another coach or even the clients that you work with?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just reiterating the fact that like you're doing less more often, so that actually, yeah, I guess this almost fits into the like the player autonomy aspect that we sort of discussed in the review of, because we know that there's no like statistical difference or like no meaningful difference between the frequencies that you do as long as the volume's achieved. Then actually, if that suits the individual better, then like you're going to get greater buy-in, the intent's going to be greater. Whereas actually, if you've got a client or an individual who, or a coach who goes, hang on a second, like this doesn't seem right, or this seems like a lot. Actually, if the player thinks that, then you have the ability to adapt and to change it based off, um, what their self preference is or how they like maybe react to that programming style. Because, like I say, if you get greater buy-in, you'll get greater intent, and they'll probably improve compliance as well, because they'll be more willing to do that. So, yeah, I think explaining the fact that they're not doing any more than they would have done in a traditional sense, but actually, if they are more comfortable with that traditional like way of approaching it, providing it's still appropriate, because I think we've still got a guardrail performance at the end of the day. And if that would mean that going into a fixture, like the 2 fixtures a week or whatever, fatigued, then like we maybe need to step in or taper it so that they're still do the frequency that they're like wanting to do, but the majority of the volume or the greater proportion of volume is done further away from match day, so that like they're still primed, they're still ready to perform, but they've still got their preference of number of times a week, and it fits for them. So yeah, it allows a greater amount of flexibility, which will hopefully improve how they perform the program that you've prescribed to them.
Yeah, and it's also like this this idea of it's not so much a application in terms of like, okay, for the next 3 weeks we're going to try a microdosing cycle. You can apply it in that fashion for sure, but it's also like the understanding that your paper provides for a lot of readers is this understanding that as long as like volume is equated throughout a certain microcycle, like however you divvy it up is, however you divvy it up. And so 1 week somebody could just say, you know what, I'm working out or I'm training from a resistance training perspective Tuesday and Thursday. I know I have a match on Saturday, but that's just how I want to do it. And then next week, maybe they're like, oh shoot, I was actually a lot more sore in like for multiple days after that session. So maybe I'm going to divvy it up and instead I'll do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but I'm just going to do half the volume. Or it could be something that I remember you had mentioned that honestly like gave me a light bulb moment when you were chatting on the Pacey Performance podcast was like this distribution of volume doesn't have to be even either. You can do like a 25-minute session or something like that on Tuesday, and then you can do like a 5 to 10 minute primer on game day, or something like that. And so I think that those ideas are really helpful just for the listeners to kind of understand.
Yeah, definitely. I think that idea of it almost like we fall into the trap of a microcycle being 7 days. You almost fall into the trap of, all right, we're dividing this volume, let's do it equally, and or let's split it across like body parts rather than doing like a whole your total body. So you divide it almost by sets. So you still do your full body program each day, but you're just doing less sets compared to actually doing, right, okay, we'll squat on this day, we'll bench on this next day, and dividing the volume up that way. Which actually, for some individuals, like I sort of mentioned before, where if you've got a really high training status, you've got to warm up to doing a 200 kilo back squat or whatever, like some of these American football, rugby players, they have to spend that time doing the warm-ups. If you have to do that repeatedly across 4 days, then that's going to increase your volume significantly, even though they are warm-up sets. Like by the time you've got there, you've still done a volume of work. So that might end up influencing how you divide up your training program, because if you're trying to do that repeatedly across 4 days, yeah, you've increased your volume. They're probably going to get bored, and it's like going to be like training monotony is going to increase. So you might then actually chunk your program into, okay, we're doing lowers across these 2 days, we're doing uppers across these 2, depending on how that then works into game day. And like you said, actually, you might front load your week and then taper it across so that you can benefit from that post-activation performance enhancement or the priming aspects. So you can manipulate it. And then this almost comes back to what we said at the start of just being really clear on your objective and the reason that you are using it, which will then just help with that planning. So it isn't just, we'll equally divide everything across our 7 days, where you're not then maybe getting some of the like detail or some of the nuance that you potentially could do.
Yeah. And I feel like that even brings up the concept or the idea from the field of sports science, right? Like this field is very new, and I think that a lot of times because there's new tech that comes out, there's new ideas that are brought up. An outsider's perspective can essentially just be this idea of like, oh well, like it's such a new concept that like there's no rigor within that, so they're just like doing whatever they want because it seems fancy or it seems fun or new. But the reality of it is that like it's in the name, right? You're just applying the scientific method to sport, right? That's what sports science is. And like the basis of all of that is like you start with a hypothesis. So like, what is your intent behind the thing that you're trying to deliver? And I think that it can be quite interesting from other people's perspectives in terms of like this idea of implementing new ideas or new frameworks. It's like, yes, I mean, this is how you push the profession forward. If you test your hypothesis, you come in with the understanding that, you're trying to disprove the null, or you're trying to prove the null, depending on whatever happens, and then from there, you just continue to iterate and iterate. And I think just that idea behind like having that intent behind what you're doing, having a hypothesis and really mapping things out, just in my head, just makes so much more sense for this implementation of anything. It could be microdosing, it could be new technology, it could be anything. But I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, and I think along those lines as well, it's probably worth considering, like you talked about hypothesis there, and whether like your null or was it effective or not? But actually, like most things, especially with the players that I work with, when they've not got a great training age, like most things could work. It just then depends on the magnitude of so. Obviously, in a lot of research papers now, you start to get effect sizes and actually an idea of like how big a change was there, not just was there a change or wasn't there. So it's definitely worth considering that. Like if you're getting a small effect size across 3 or 4 weeks, then it's still an improvement. And if you then add that together across multiple 3 or 4 weeks across your long season, you're ending either in a better place than you started in season, which is maybe unusual, is maybe not, but actually you've certainly not been detrimental to your athlete by just making small improvements. So yeah, I really buy into that, and I think it's definitely worth considering the magnitude and the time frame that you're wanting to apply something over, or wanting to get improvements over, or just maintenance. Actually, like if you maintain across a 40 odd week period, like some of the team sports have in season, then like you're potentially winning compared to other individuals who might be detraining over that same period.
Yeah. Spoken like a true PhD, adding the nuance into that conversation. I appreciate that, Matt. We've got a little bit of extra time left just to dive in. I think a question that I try and ask as many researchers on these kind of paper-specific episodes of Research Unpacked. And this is where I think we can kind of dive into some of the other topics of this paper. But oftentimes I think this whole podcast is kind of a great example of like what people should take away from this paper, right? But in your idea or in your opinion, what shouldn't people take away from this paper? Like, what are some things that would be either a misrepresentation of what microdosing is, a misunderstanding, or some other poor implementation of, what this concept can help with?
Yeah, so I guess within the paper we've described that, and you mentioned it earlier, around minimum effective dose not or being misconceived to be synonymous with microdosing. So like that's something again they should take away from that. But like there's I think there's sometimes a bit of confusion, and there's been a couple of papers published where it has been used synonymously. So I definitely just squash that. Like I think you can microdose, or you can try microdosing a minimum effective dose. But you can also microdose your maximum effective dose and have that planned overreaching aspect. So there's definitely a full continuum that you can go through, or that like training zone as we've called it. What in terms of what people shouldn't take away, I don't think microdosing is necessarily still the be all and end all. Like we've talked about flavor of the month trend. There's going to be time periods within your season or across a career where microdosing isn't appropriate or isn't appropriate for everyone at all times. I think it's just another tool that has lots of like we've talked about, lots of different benefits to it, but there actually might be some drawbacks with some individuals or within some sports. Like with your individual, if we like go away from team sports for a second and like focus on like individual athletes or tactical groups or anything like that, there might be times where you go, you know what, we're just going to go for a traditional like type approach. We have the time to do it. We want to increase the amount of loads within one session that they're doing for whatever reason. So yeah, like going across that general preparation, traditional general preparation might actually be the right thing at the right time for them. So yeah, I think it's another tool in the toolbox that we can use and has potentially loads of benefits off the back of it. But again, there might be some withdrawal, some issues that may arise or just maybe inappropriate for certain groups. So definitely keep it as something in the back pocket that you can use at the right time.
Yeah, Matt. Well, first off, thank you so much for hopping on and sharing all of like your insights and research around this topic. I think this will be exponentially helpful for a lot of our listeners being in certain areas similar to yourself, whether it's professional, semi-professional, collegiate sport, in various roles and things like that. And so I think that just having you on has been awesome for all of our listeners as well as myself. But given, your understanding of the population that we have in terms of our listeners, knowing that it's surrounded by sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches, physios, in your opinion, for these Research Unpacked episodes, who do you think we should have on next?
Oh, that's a great shout. I mean, being Salford through and through, like there's obviously Paul Comfort around some of the Olympic weightlifting speaks really well. John McMahon is someone who was on our paper as well, and he does a lot of research around force plate analysis and like data collection around that. So yeah, he'd definitely be someone interesting to get on, knowing sort of the full process, start to finish, around not just then collecting the data, but how it's visualized and how it's then interpreted and fed back to clubs. Whilst not necessarily working at a club himself, you need to be quite explicit so it's not misinterpreted. So yeah, he'd be another good individual to get on. And then someone else from Salford, because I'm very biased, would be Nick Ripley, from like maybe more of your physio type work, but he's done a lot of research into like hamstring strain injury. That's what his PhD was in, and some of the application of strength conditioning in support of that. So again, he'd be a very interesting person to listen to.
Awesome. Well, Paul, John, and Nick, we're coming for you. So Matt, just closing things out, for anybody who really resonated with what you're doing in terms of your research, as well as just, how you've delivered some of this information, How can people best either reach out to you, connect with you, get in contact, any of those sorts of things?
Yes, it's like Twitter is usually the best, well, or X as it's called now. It's like usually a good method. So at m_Cuthbert15 is the handle on that, and then LinkedIn as well is usually a pretty good one. So I think I'm now down as Dr Matt Cuthbert or Mathew Cuthbert, one of the two. I might have full name myself. So yeah, like LinkedIn or Twitter usually, and like you've experienced, if you don't get a response straight away, then don't be afraid to pester, because I do get around to replying eventually.
Exactly. Yeah. First-hand experience. That was not a somebody that wanted to let go. This is an awesome conversation. And yeah, man, I really appreciate you having the time to, hop on the podcast, and hopefully we'll be seeing more future research coming out from you guys.
Yeah, for sure. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for asking me to be involved.